So, if you think covert narcissistic abuse is just an issue between two people behind closed doors, well, you're missing the invisible system that's actually keeping victims trapped. Most of us just picture one abuser, one victim, totally isolated in a vacuum, right? But honestly, that picture is dangerously incomplete. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the structural architecture of covert abuse. We're going to break down how a covert abuser doesn't just operate alone, but actually relies on this whole supporting cast, who are usually completely unwitting, literally working the door for them. All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today to understand how a covert abuser gets protected by default. We're going to start with the illusion of isolation, then move through the family and community infrastructure, examine those deeply ingrained cultural scripts, look specifically at the male victim experience, and finally we'll wrap up with some tactical ways to build outside of this system. Okay, let's jump right into section 1, the illusion of isolation. Right off the bat, it's absolutely crucial to understand that the abuser does not exist on an island. There is an audience to the relationship, and believe me, that audience has opinions. Now, this isn't some malicious conspiracy. It's not a group of evil people sitting around plotting against a victim. Actually, it's a system that just protects the abuser by default. It's this dynamic where friends, family, and society inadvertently act as a buffer for the abuser, and that leaves the targeted individual basically swimming against the current all by themselves. It's a default setting that victims find themselves fighting literally every single day. Moving on to section 2, ring 1, family infrastructure. Let's zoom in on the family system, which has likely spent decades building up these threat management protocols that are cleverly masked as just being attentive. Inside this system, we see some really clearly assigned roles. First, you've got the enablers. This is usually a parent who has spent maybe 40 years translating bad behavior into acceptable English. They're the ones saying things like, oh, she just feels things deeply, or, she's always been sensitive. Every family has a translator, and not translation, it always favors the narcissist. Then you've got the flying monkeys. This is essentially outsourced pressure with totally clean hands. So after a conflict, the abuser doesn't reach out. Instead, a sibling texts and says, she's really upset. She just doesn't feel like you support her. It's a brilliant way to enforce a social cost for a victim's resistance, all without the abuser having to lift a single finger. So that really makes you wonder, where exactly is the neutral ground here? The thing is, the covert abuser has spent years charming absolutely everyone around them. They remember birthdays, they give the most thoughtful gifts. They build this public persona that isn't just an image, it's actual infrastructure. Every charmed dinner party was literally a brick in a wall built years in advance. They don't just train their own family to manage them, they actively recruit the victim's family to absolutely adore them. And that leads us to this absolute gut punch of a quote from our sources. This was actually shared by a victim's own mother when he just gently hinted at some problems at home. She said, well, I hope you're not taking her for granted. She does so much for you. I mean, wow, her family manages her, and the victim's family adores her. The perimeter is now fully enclosed. You have a victim's own mother batting for the other team, simply because she's responding to the only data she has ever been shown. All right, let's zoom out a bit to section 3, ring 2, community reputation. So, moving past the family, we hit the community level. We're talking friends, schools, churches, therapists. And this is exactly where the covert style really pays its dividends. In this space, social capital is exactly what it sounds like. It is currency, spendable currency. The covert abuser doesn't look like your typical loud, aggressive bully. No way. She's the school-run favorite. She's the one organizing the charity bake sale. You see, communities don't weigh evidence. They weigh reputation. And her reputation account, it has decades of deposits. Meanwhile, the victim just seems like, a decent bloke who keeps to himself. It's simply not a fair fight, because she has been campaigning since way before anyone even realized there was an election going on. Let's walk through how this slow drip, preemptive narrative actually works. It's not some masterminded evil smear campaign. It's highly deniable, reflexive narrative building. It starts with small sighs at book club, a worried look when a certain name comes up, little comments like, he's just been so distant lately. The wild thing is the abuser sincerely believes her own victimhood. And that's exactly why liars get caught, but believers don't. By the time a victim finally confides in a mutual friend, the groundwork is already laid. That friend just does the math and decides that the victim's valid reaction must actually be the difficult behavior the abuser has been silently coping with all this time. So the victim's testimony literally becomes evidence for the prosecution. I want you to really consider this powerful insight from the sources. The system doesn't need to silence you. It just needs to make speaking cost more than silence. Because their truth is instantly weaponized against them, victims rationally and completely voluntarily end up isolating themselves. Even in a setting like therapy, the covert narcissist is often totally fluent in therapy speak. They get tearful in all the right places, essentially turning the professional's room into just another venue for their performance. This brings us to Section 4, Ring 3, Cultural Scripts.
Now we're diving into the biggest ring of them all, the unwritten cultural operating system. These are the rules that everyone is running without even knowing they're running them. Basically, different bars, same cage. Culture penalizes the telling of the abuse rather than the abuse itself. You've got rules like don't air your dirty laundry, which means the victim who speaks up is committing a social offense of disloyalty, while the abuser who stays quiet gets off scot-free. Phrases like marriage is shared work or just think of the children are constantly used to enforce endurance. In collectivist cultures, this pressure is immense because a public accusation threatens the standing of the entire family. But individualist cultures, like in Britain or the US, they don't let anyone off the hook either. They just privatize the issue. Victims experience this atomized isolation where everyone just politely agrees that what happens in someone else's house is strictly their own business.
Let's shift gears slightly for Section 5, the male victim experience. So every single protective script we just talked about gets a massive multiplier when the victim happens to be a man. A male victim is always standing right next to the default cultural template of an abuser, which is male, physically dangerous, and aggressive. Because of this, psychological abuse against men is basically culturally illegible. It usually just gets filed under comedy. You know, the nagging wife, the henpecked husband trope. Men have laughed along with this joke for so long that when it actually happens to them, they often just laugh at themselves. But make no mistake, in any public contest, if things ever escalate, a tearful victim posture is an automatic winning hand. His anger is instantly seen as evidence of abuse, while her anger is just seen as distress.
And this creates the ultimate checkmate scenario. Knowing this cultural template, men often moderate themselves into absolute nothingness. They never raise their voices. They constantly monitor their tone while they're being quietly dismantled. And what happens then? The system reads them as cold, detached, and aloof. The self-control literally becomes the charge sheet. A male victim gets accused of being emotionally unavailable precisely because expressing full emotion was ruled completely inadmissible for him from day one.
All right, final section, Section 6, Tactics for Building Outside. Now, let's shift to some empowering solutions. We're transitioning from the overwhelming weight of this whole system to actual, tactical ways to get your sanity back. Look, you cannot argue with a culture, but an individual can absolutely change their decisions. The sources outline a few really key survival rules here. First off, stop trying to win the narrative war against someone with a 40-year head start on charm. Your job isn't to be believed by everyone. Your job is to be okay. Second, build outside the system. Find safe witnesses the abuser hasn't charmed yet, maybe a therapist who has never met her or a really old friend. Third, choose your disclosures tactically to avoid any shared networks. Safe disclosures should always go to people completely outside the perimeter first. And finally, name the system daily. Places like the Mankind Initiative or the Men's Advice Line exist for a reason. You need a neutral party whose actual job is care rather than managing some kind of reputation risk. I really want you to take a moment and consider this core takeaway from the research. Unanimity from a captured audience isn't truth, it's reach. You're not mad, you're just outnumbered. If an entire community thinks a partner is a saint, and the victim concludes from that unanimous vote that they must be losing their mind, they really need to count the electorate. Every single voter got their information from the abuser. It's not proof that you're crazy, it's literally just data showing that the system is working exactly as it was designed to. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If the systems described in our sources were built to take a victim's judgment away, what will you build today to take it back? People can be argued with, for sure, but systems cannot. Once the rings of this architecture become visible to you, their verdicts stop functioning as evidence against you. Step outside that invisible cage, look closely at the architecture of the system, and trust the evidence that is right in front of you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep building, and go take your judgment back.